bring with me today this little book. It's a murder mystery based in the town where I was born, Seneca Falls, New York. It has a lot in here except my name that makes it a commendable read. I bring it to you this morning for two reasons. The first is the first line of the prologue, which when I read it the first time, I underlined it. The second time, I wrote "great" with an arrow, and I almost put it into memory. It did not occur to Friedrich Steiner that he would die. He had everything he thought assured him a good life. Good health, he had wealth, he had love from some, respect from many, and a God who did not greatly confuse him. How many of us know how that feels to be confused about God? And so this morning I thought I would maybe clear up some confusion or create some more, and title the sermon, "Size Matters, an Adequate God." He had the respect from many, and a God who did not greatly confuse him. The second reason I bring this little book is that, as I said, I was born in Seneca Falls, the hometown where the women's suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, that whole suffrage group. The federal government has put a marvelous museum there in the old firehouse, showing us how important it is that women eventually, with great struggle, are giving the right to vote and to become first-class citizens. I'm proud of my town, and have been all my life. It was at age 8 that my great-uncle gave me my first bicycle. It was a full-size bike, and I wasn't quite full-size, but we made it work. And I rode that almost constantly. Until one Sunday I headed for the street with it after we'd been to church. My mother said, "You can't ride your bicycle in the street today because it's Sunday." Remember those days? Couldn't dance, couldn't play cards, couldn't do anything on Sunday except Sunday. So I said to her in the first theological statement of my life, "Isn't it Sunday in the backyard?" I think probably I got a reprimand for being a smart aleck. At that same time, when I was 8 years old or so, I still would come home from church and get either a reprimand or a spanking because I had not behaved in church. I wanted to talk all the time in church. So I got in trouble every Sunday to the extent that I thought it was part of the Sunday service. Come home and just sort of hit it. Many years later, well, 10 years or so after that, it occurred to me that if I went into the ministry and became a preacher, I could talk in church. And so some 60 years later, here I am to talk to you about a God who is adequate and not confusing. So that was my first theological statement. Isn't it Sunday out there in the backyard? Sure it was, but people wouldn't see me riding the bike, and that's what was important. My second theological question or statement came some years later, I think, when I began to wonder, how big is God? And is he big enough? I remember when we had a thunderstorm, Mother would say, "That's God bowling." Man, what a bowling alley it must be. Or when something would happen that was out of the ordinary, Mother would say, "God is at work there." And I would wonder, how big is God to be able to do all this stuff that was going on? So this morning, to open our service, I chose the hymn, "Holy, Holy, Holy," for two reasons. One is that my friend Steve Poyser doesn't like that hymn. He said growing up they sang it every every Sunday in the Methodist church until he learned it by heart. So I thought we'd refresh it for him. And I noticed that Steve wasn't singing very robustly on that. But the second reason I chose that is that when we think about God, sometimes we think about holy, holy, holy. Big, huge, almighty, ever-present, sovereign, knows everything, does everything. Started the earth, spun it into action, and here we are. One Sunday, some time ago, Rob said, in the middle of a sermon, standing there, looking us in the eye, and he said, "I don't believe in a holy God." I thought, holy cow. A new minister coming to a new parish saying he does not believe in a holy God. I puzzled on that for a long time until it came to me that Rob was talking about a holy God who is so distant, so almighty, so fearsome, so much a creator, so huge and distant that God has become irrelevant. Some people believe that God just sort of started everything and walked away. Too big, too huge, too distant. Not my kind of God. I have no use for that kind of God. So through the generations, I think maybe in the last 40 or 50 years, people have become distant themselves from that kind of God. I think that's too bad, because that kind of God still has a place in our lives. But kind of hard to get a hold of the strings, to pull him down, him or her, or however you want to say it, the nurturer. How do we get hold of a God that's so big? And I think what has happened is that we've gone the other way, possibly too far, and we've made our God too small. How big is God? Does the size of God really matter? What do we talk about when we talk about an adequate God? Is a God too small for us? An adequate God? If we make God into our best friend, bottle him up, stick him in our back pocket, carry him around like a charm, and just refer every once in a while as if it's a friend of some kind that really doesn't do anything for us except make us feel good, what kind of a God is that? That God is too small. That kind of a God is easily ignored. That kind of a God becomes a God on demand, and the rest of the time, God, just leave me alone until I need you now. Put 25 cents in the slot machine of prayer and get back whatever I need. I don't think that kind of a God serves us very well either. Becomes irrelevant, misplaced, and pretty much useless. I think that has had an effect on church attendance and people's faith. That God has become just another something to kind of play with or not, or be with or not, or call upon or not, or I can do okay on my own, I don't need God. Because God has become useless, too small, not a God. We'll just do something else. So we have the holy God on one side that is too big and too almighty and too sovereign and too distant. On the other hand, we have a God that is too small, not much use, doesn't do much for us, irrelevant. But saying that has nothing to do, really, with the true nature of God. God is what he is, or she is, or whatever you want to say. It's our perception of our God through our faith that brings our God into what we want to have and need as an adequate God. So what we say here is perception that has nothing to do with the nature of God. God is God. I am who I am. So in that perception of God, how we, when we close our eyes, what do we feel or hear or see? What do we need? What's that image that we're talking to? It's how we practice the presence of God in our own lives. My sister wrote that they were having dinner, and and they have an adopted Korean child in their family who's 5 or 6. My sister offered a prayer, and when it was over with, the child said to his father, "Who was she talking to?" When you pray, when you think of God, what are you talking to? What is there that you see or you feel or you need as you practice the presence of God in your life? A God who is the right size. The God who is there when you need Him and there when you don't. How might we then describe or define an adequate God in terms of size, the kind of God that when we close our eyes, we hope we see and feel and need? Bob read this morning the Lord's Prayer. I'm going to read that again. Because in those 17 words, or whatever it is a description, a definition, a shape for God. God's offer to us. The Lord is my shepherd. He offers a relationship. I shall not be in want. He offers to us supply. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He offers us rest. He leads me beside still waters. He refreshes. He restores my soul. We have a God who heals. He offers that. Then comes the relationship part. He leads me in paths of righteousness. He gives me guidance for my life. For His name's sake, I get a purpose for what I do in the presence of God. Even though I walk through the valley in the lowliness and loneliness of life, in the shadow of death, that relationship tests me. But then with God, it always comes the payoff. I will fear no evil. I will have protection. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me. I get disciplined with God. And finally, then, the fulfillment. Thou preparest a table before me. Thou anointest my head with oil. I am chosen by God. My cup overflows. God gives me in fulfillment abundance. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. I receive a blessing. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That is the fulfillment of eternity. Just wrap your soul for a moment around those words. See if that's the kind of God who is adequate. See if that's the kind of God who is the right size, the right shape, the right definition for you and for us. Well, then you say, Jim, okay, so what? So what? You're talking about God, so what? What I always like to do in a sermon is say there is at the end of the sermon always a therefore. Take this and do something with it. Therefore. What is the helpfulness of your God? What is the relevance of what we believe? How do we get past the confusion that was mentioned there that that man was pleased that he did not have in terms of his God? Well, I'll make 3 quick suggestions here on the therefore part. The adequate God I have, the right-sized God that we have, helps us deal very well sometimes with a messy world. Just think of where we would be if in war we did not feel that there was the purposes of our God. Think of how we would deal with poverty across the world if we didn't feel there was a moral standard that God is calling us to be about in this messy world. Is the power that we have in our God, a power to deal with poverty and war and justice and all of those kinds of things. And what does our God say to us about contrary gods? What does it say to us about our understanding of Allah, for instance, or other religions? Is our God big enough to help us incorporate and encompass those understandings in this messy world? And how about a God who helps us deal with ill health, even death? How could we possibly make it without some sense there's a power adequate beyond us to help us make it through the living of our days? God helps us adequately to deal with a messy world. He also comes to us, he shares our common lot without ending up in our back pocket, and he says, I will help you improve as a human being. I will help you improve in your faith. I will help you become a decent person. That's not complicated. We have a whole Bible that tells us about being decent. I believe if you take all of the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, all the teachings of Jesus, all the history of the church, boil it all down and make it into something that says, learn how to be and be a decent person. What a world we would have if everybody would just be decent to each other. It's not complicated. God asks us to improve our lives, to take on the bias of the Christian faith and his teachings, to bend our lives toward the good and to goodness. And that's not hard to do with an adequate God. God comes to share our common lot through Jesus Christ to improve our lives and to help us to be just simply good people. And third, what does an adequate God, the right size, say to us, as Rob says every Sunday, how are we going to live the gospel? How are we going to better be the living church? What kind of a God does it take for us to become the body and members of Christ? What kind of a God is it who will lead us now to another transition, to the kind of growth and stewardship and activity that Pastor Rob talks about every Sunday? Is the God we celebrate and have adequate to do that with us and for us, to inspire us and to motivate us and to make us decent people with each other so that we can grow and live and have our being in the midst of a church and a community which knows the gospel through us? What then do we say about an adequate God who takes on a shape, who has a definition, who does not want us to be confused? Well, we say, that is what we do here. There's no other place that we have in our society which talks about God and the adequacy of God and the therefores of life like it does in the church. I think our society now is forgetting about a lot of that, therefore losing its moral standards, its sense of purpose and divinity, and I think that's too bad. Because talking theologically, what we do when we talk about an adequate God, we're talking in theological statements. This is what we do here. We live out the definition of the gospel. We give it arms and legs and voice and ears, sometimes hair, and we go for it. To talk about the adequate God, the right size, comes to us. For it did not occur to Friedrich Steiner that he would ever die. He had everything he thought assured him life. He had good health. He had wealth. He had love from some, respect from many, and a God who did not confuse him.